For the past 2 weeks, we've looked back at policies Wren helped pass that have furthered the gender justice movement in South Carolina. Now, we're looking ahead at an issue that has a strong tie to the gender justice movement: voting rights. To Wren, voting rights means having the ability to cast a ballot and choose who represents you, free from intimidation and structural barriers. It is not just the ability to vote, but also access to the vote.
The history of voting rights in our country is a long one. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights explains it by saying, "At our nation's founding, voting was enshrined only for educated white men who own property. It took more than a century for the franchise to meaningfully expand to people of color, women, people with disabilities, people who are low income, and Native American."
Throughout the history of the United States, voting rights have been expanded repeatedly by constitutional amendments and legislation. We're going to go through a quick history of voting rights now. In 1776, at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, free white male property owners got the right to vote unless they were members of certain religious groups. In 1856, white males at least 21 could vote without property or religious requirements. In 1870, the 15th Amendment extended the right to vote to all races. However, poll tax, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses eventually prevented most black males from voting. In 1921, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. In 1924, Congress passed legislation extending citizenship and therefore voting rights to Native Americans, but many states continued to deny these voting rights. In 1943, Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Acts to ensure Chinese Americans had the right to vote. In 1947, South Carolina's right to continue its white primary practice was declared unconstitutional by a federal court in the case Elmore v. Rice. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment gave D.C. residents the right to vote for president and vice president, but not Congress. In 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibited the use of poll taxes for federal elections. And in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act that outlawed barriers to political participation by racial and ethnic minorities such as literacy tests and discriminatory districting and registration practices. In 1970, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. In 1975, the Voting Rights Act was amended to provide assistance for language minority citizens. In 1982, the Voting Rights Act was amended to allow for assistance for blind, disabled, or illiterate voters. And in 2006, the Voting Rights Act was renewed for 25 additional years.
The right to vote is central to what makes democracy work, but this right is relatively new to many marginalized populations. If you notice in our timeline of voting rights, it wasn't until the 20th century that marginalized groups started being granted the right to vote, hundreds of years after voting was first established in this country. And even then, things like literacy tests, voter intimidation, and poll taxes effectively disenfranchised most groups.
Even today in 2021, the right to vote is still not held equally by all U.S. citizens. D.C. residents have no representation in the U.S. House or Senate. A person with a felony conviction may or may not have the right to vote depending on the state they live in. And many states have put into place various restrictions on voting, often based on false claims of voter fraud and thinly veiled disenfranchisement labeled as securing the ballot. Examples of restrictions to voting rights include voter ID laws. South Carolina enacted one in 2011. This is especially harmful to trans people who may not be able to vote with an ID that correctly reflects their gender identities. Others include prohibiting supporting voters waiting in line, for example, not allowing people to hand out water bottles, food, or chairs, restrictions on absentee and by mail voting, the accessibility of polling locations, signature matching and witness signature requirements, purging the voter rolls, changing polling locations without notification, and so much more.
So, how do voting rights tie into the movement for gender justice? Voting is the powerful weapon communities across this country have when it comes to protecting rights to control our bodies. Barriers to restricting voting access are systematically used to target the same people who would be most affected by anti-abortion laws and attacks on sexual and reproductive health care. Black and brown communities, immigrants, LGBTQ plus people, people with low incomes, people with disabilities, and young people. Equitable access to the vote means better representation of our communities and responsiveness to our basic needs, like comprehensive health care, including contraception, maternal care, abortion care, and comprehensive sex education. Moreover, equitable access to the ballot box allows us to focus on justice and liberation, which increases bodily autonomy and integrity for many marginalized communities, especially Black and brown people, young people, and queer, transgender, and non-binary people.
What has Wren done to advance voting rights? Wren has joined a broad coalition of statewide supporters in demanding the passage of federal voting rights bills to stop voter suppression and protect full, fair, and equal access to the ballot box. We've joined a federal sign-on letter in support of voting rights, and we've testified in support of bills that would expand voting rights and in opposition to bills that restrict them. In the future, Wren will be testifying and advocating in support of South Carolina House Bill 3822, a bill that will improve people's access to voting by instituting well-tested approaches to expand secure access through in-person and mail early voting for qualified electors. This bill is necessary because voting on a single workday no longer serves the needs of modern South Carolinians. Most adults in South Carolina work and care for their family members, which makes it difficult for them to vote on Election Day.
Hopefully, this deep dive into what voting rights are and their history has helped you understand how vital voting rights are to the movement for gender justice. As Wren continues to advocate for voting rights, we hope you'll join us in supporting House Bill 3822 and any other voting rights bills that come up. We received a number of comments during week 3 of our gender justice educational series on white supremacy from people who wanted us to delve deeper into the topic. So next week, that's exactly what we're going to do. Join us next week as we talk about racism and what it means to be anti-racist. And as always, please share this video with a friend.